my love, why did you have to leave me? I can't bear this pain without you. Please come back to me.
For 11 years, Emily Carter believed the ocean had stolen her husband. Every birthday passed in silence. Every anniversary became another reminder that somewhere beneath dark Australian waters, the man she once built her entire life around had disappeared forever. She folded away his clothes into boxes she could never bring herself to open again. She sat beside a memorial stone with no body beneath it. She spent nights replaying his final voicemail over and over until she could recite every breath, every pause, every word. Friends told her grief would soften with time, but grief did not soften for Emily. It changed shape. It followed her into grocery stores, into quiet mornings, into empty spaces in bed that still belonged to him long after the world told her to move on. Then one ordinary afternoon inside a shopping center in Queensland, Emily looked across a crowded department store and saw her dead husband standing near the children's shoe section, laughing beside another woman, while helping 3 children try on school shoes she had never seen before. And in that moment, 11 years of mourning shattered in less than 5 seconds. Because the man buried in her memory had never died at all. He had simply chosen another life. And what investigators uncovered next would leave an entire country speechless. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There are some betrayals so cruel that they don't end when the truth is finally exposed. Sometimes the real damage begins the moment a person realizes their entire past was carefully constructed around lies. For Emily Carter, the nightmare started in Sydney during the winter of 2001. Back then, her life appeared ordinary in the kind of comforting way many people spend years chasing. She lived in a quiet coastal suburb with her husband Daniel Carter, a man neighbors described as dependable, calm, and deeply devoted to his family. Daniel worked long hours as a marine mechanic, the kind of man who smelled faintly of salt water and engine oil when he came home at night. He loved boating, fishing, and the ocean. Friends often joked that Daniel trusted the sea more than he trusted people. Emily trusted him completely. They had been married for 13 years, and while every marriage carries its hidden tensions, theirs looked solid from the outside. They hosted barbecues during summer weekends, attended birthdays together, and spent evenings planning the future they believed was waiting for them. Emily often spoke about wanting children, but after years of failed attempts and heartbreaking miscarriages, the subject slowly became too painful to discuss openly. Daniel rarely talked about it, but Emily believed the silence came from grief, not distance. Looking back years later, she would wonder whether that silence had been hiding something else entirely. The first strange detail appeared months before Daniel disappeared, though Emily barely noticed it at the time. Daniel began taking more trips for work, often driving interstate for repairs he claimed required specialized attention. Sometimes he stayed away for days. He started guarding his phone carefully, stepping outside during calls and lowering his voice whenever Emily entered the room unexpectedly. There were unexplained cash withdrawals from their joint account, and receipts from places Daniel insisted he had never visited. Once, Emily found a children's drawing tucked between papers in his jacket pocket. It showed a man holding hands with 2 small kids beneath a bright yellow sun. On the back were the words, "Love you, Dad." When she asked Daniel about it, he laughed awkwardly and claimed one of his co-workers' children must have slipped it into his coat as a joke. Emily wanted to believe him because trust is a dangerous thing when mixed with love. People often convince themselves of comforting explanations long before accepting painful truths. Then came the boating trip that changed everything. On August 17, 2001, Daniel told Emily he planned to spend the weekend fishing alone near the New South Wales coastline. He had done similar trips before, so nothing about it seemed unusual. Emily remembered kissing him goodbye near sunrise while he loaded supplies into the back of his truck. She remembered the way he looked at her before leaving, holding her face for a few seconds longer than usual. For years afterward, she replayed that moment constantly, wondering whether guilt had already been sitting behind his eyes. That evening, weather conditions worsened dramatically along the coast. Heavy rain rolled across the water, and strong winds triggered warnings for small vessels. Emily tried calling Daniel several times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. At around 2:13 a.m., police knocked on her front door. A damaged boat matching Daniel's vessel had been discovered drifting near rocky waters several miles offshore. Rescue teams searched for 48 hours. Pieces of wreckage washed ashore. A life jacket was recovered. But Daniel Carter's body was never found. The days that followed felt unreal to Emily. Reporters gathered outside her home. Volunteers joined search efforts. Friends delivered casseroles she could barely eat. Detectives explained that strong currents often prevented bodies from resurfacing after maritime accidents. Eventually, the official assumption became simple and devastating. Daniel Carter had drowned. Emily remembered standing at a memorial service surrounded by flowers while listening to people describe her husband in the past tense. She remembered staring at the ocean afterward, unable to understand how a human being could simply vanish from existence. Without a body, there was no funeral in the traditional sense, only grief stretched endlessly across unanswered questions. Still, Emily tried to rebuild. She returned to work after several months. She attended therapy sessions. She sold Daniel's boat storage unit, but certain things never made sense to her. Daniel's wallet had never been recovered. His wedding ring was missing. And just 6 months before the accident, Daniel had quietly increased his life insurance policy to nearly $2 million. At the time, investigators dismissed it as coincidence. Emily accepted the explanation because accepting anything else would have required questioning the man she had loved for over a decade. Years passed slowly. Emily aged through grief in the quietest possible ways. She stopped attending social gatherings. She stopped answering questions about whether she would ever remarry. Every now and then, some would mention spotting a man who looked like Daniel somewhere interstate, but the stories always sounded ridiculous. One claimed he had been seen at a petrol station in Brisbane. Another insisted he was living under another name in Perth. Emily ignored them because false hope can destroy a grieving person more completely than loss itself. By the 10th year after Daniel's disappearance, Emily had finally begun allowing herself small pieces of happiness again. She started volunteering at a local charity shop. She took weekend trips with friends and she even considered moving away from Sydney entirely. Then, during a short holiday in Queensland, everything changed. It happened inside a busy shopping center just after lunch on a Saturday afternoon. Emily had been walking through a department store when she noticed a man several meters ahead, helping a young boy tie his shoe. There was nothing remarkable about the scene at first. But then the man laughed. Emily froze instantly because some sounds never leave human memory. She later told investigators that hearing Daniel's laugh felt like hearing a ghost speak directly into her ear. The man stood upright, turning slightly toward the aisle, and Emily felt her entire body go numb. He looked older. His hair was shorter and partially gray. He wore glasses Daniel had never needed before, but the scar near his jawline was identical. The posture was identical. Even the way he rubbed the back of his neck while talking matched the man she had once shared a home with. Standing beside him was a blonde woman holding shopping bags while 3 children circled around them laughing. Emily could not breathe. For 11 years she had mourned a dead husband. Now he was standing 20 feet away buying school shoes with another family, as if his previous life had never existed. At first, Emily convinced herself she was hallucinating. Trauma can play terrifying tricks on memory. But then the man looked directly at her, and in that split second, recognition flashed across his face. Witnesses later described seeing the color drain from him almost instantly. He grabbed one of the children by the hand and quickly began steering his family toward another exit. Emily followed in complete shock, calling Daniel's name repeatedly through the crowded shopping center. But the man never answered. He moved faster, disappearing into the parking structure before Emily could reach him. By the time security arrived, the vehicle was gone. Most people would assume such a story sounds impossible. Detectives initially believed Emily had mistaken a stranger for her deceased husband, but Emily refused to let it go. Something inside her knew with absolute certainty that the man she had buried in her heart for over a decade was still alive. What investigators uncovered during the following months would unravel one of the most disturbing deception cases Australia had seen in years. Detectives in Queensland did not reopen the case immediately. To them, Emily Carter sounded like another grieving widow unable to let go of the past. They had seen similar situations before. People swear they spot dead relatives in airports, supermarkets, train stations, crowded streets. The human brain searches for familiar faces everywhere when grief becomes permanent. But Emily was different. She did not sound confused when she spoke with investigators. She sounded terrified. There was a certainty in her voice that unsettled even experienced officers. She described details nobody else could have recognized unless they had lived beside Daniel Carter for years. The scar beneath his jaw came from a boating accident when he was 23. The slight limp in his left leg appeared only when he was tired. Even the way he held shopping bags using only 3 fingers matched Daniel's habits exactly. Emily kept repeating the same sentence during interviews. He looked at me like he knew I wasn't supposed to find him. That sentence stayed with Detective Aaron Mitchell long after their first meeting ended. Because innocent people usually react with confusion when mistaken for someone else. They do not panic and run. The first breakthrough came from shopping center security footage. Investigators reviewed several hours of recordings before eventually spotting the man Emily had described. At first glance, he appeared to be an ordinary middle-aged father shopping with his family. But when technicians enhanced the footage, similarities became impossible to ignore. Facial measurements closely matched old photographs of Daniel Carter. Height, posture, ear structure, and jaw shape aligned almost perfectly. Then investigators noticed something else. The moment Emily entered the frame, the man froze. He stared directly at her before quickly turning away. Seconds later, he gathered his family and rushed toward the parking area. Detectives replayed that sequence repeatedly. Each time it became harder to dismiss Emily's claims. Within days, authorities traced the vehicle registration connected to the family seen in the footage. The car belonged to a man named Michael Reynolds living nearly 2 hours away in a quiet suburb outside Brisbane. According to official records, Michael Reynolds had been born in South Australia in 1970 and worked as an equipment supplier for marine construction companies. He had been married for 9 years and was the father of 3 children. On paper, his identity appeared completely legitimate. But certain details immediately raised suspicion. There were almost no records of Michael Reynolds existing before 2002, less than a year after Daniel Carter vanished into the ocean. Detectives began digging deeper. Financial records revealed Michael Reynolds had purchased property using large cash deposits spread carefully over several years. His employment history contained unusual gaps. Tax documents seemed incomplete. And perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators discovered Michael avoided hospitals, government renewals, and almost every process requiring extensive identity verification. It was as if someone had built a life designed to remain just believable enough to avoid attention. Quietly, investigators obtained fingerprints from a coffee cup Michael Reynolds discarded outside a cafe. When forensic results returned, the room reportedly fell silent. The prints matched Daniel Carter exactly. 11 years after being declared dead, Emily's husband had been living under another name with an entirely different family. News of the discovery spread rapidly through internal police departments before eventually leaking to journalists. Emily sat alone in her kitchen when detectives finally confirmed the truth to her in person. She later admitted that part of her still expected relief when hearing Daniel was alive. Instead, she felt something colder, rage mixed with humiliation. Because death would have been easier to accept than abandonment. For 11 years, she had blamed herself for surviving, while he disappeared beneath the ocean. She had replayed their final conversations endlessly, wondering whether she had loved him enough during his last days alive. Meanwhile, Daniel had apparently been celebrating birthdays, raising children, attending school events, and building memories with another family while she grieved beside an empty grave. The cruelty of it shattered something inside her that investigators would later describe as irreversible. Authorities arrested Daniel, still legally known in Queensland as Michael Reynolds, outside his workplace 3 weeks later. Witnesses described him remaining strangely calm throughout the arrest. He did not resist. He did not ask whether Emily was okay. His first concern reportedly involved whether his children had witnessed the police arrival. During initial questioning, Daniel denied everything despite overwhelming evidence. He insisted there had been some mistake. But lies become fragile once investigators begin assembling timelines. Phone records placed him in Queensland months before the boating accident. Rental agreements connected him to apartments under false names. Even more disturbing, detectives uncovered evidence suggesting Daniel had maintained a relationship with his second wife years before his disappearance. Her name was Laura Reynolds, though investigators later confirmed she had believed Michael Reynolds was genuinely widowed. According to friends close to Laura, he claimed his first wife had died in a car accident many years earlier. He carried photographs of Emily stored away in boxes, but presented them as distant relatives. The deception had not targeted only one woman. Daniel had manipulated 2 separate families into believing entirely different versions of reality. As investigators reconstructed the years leading up to the fake death, the planning became increasingly disturbing. Daniel had spent nearly 3 years preparing to disappear. He secretly transferred money into hidden accounts under false identities. He studied maritime accident reports and researched how long search operations typically lasted when bodies were unrecovered. He purchased survival gear using cash. Most chilling of all, investigators discovered he had intentionally damaged sections of his own boat weeks before the staged accident. Experts later concluded the vessel had been sabotaged carefully enough to create the appearance of storm damage without leaving obvious signs of deliberate destruction. Daniel had essentially designed his own disappearance like a performance, and he almost succeeded permanently. The question haunting investigators was simple. Why would someone abandon an entire life so completely? At first, authorities assumed financial pressure played a major role. Daniel carried significant hidden debt tied to failed business investments Emily never knew existed. But money alone could not explain the years of calculated deception. Former co-workers described Daniel as deeply dissatisfied long before his disappearance. He often spoke about feeling trapped by expectations, routines, and responsibilities. One former friend later revealed Daniel once made a disturbing comment during a late-night conversation near the marina. "Sometimes I think people would appreciate me more if I disappeared." At the time, everyone laughed awkwardly. Years later, those words sounded far more unsettling. But perhaps the most painful discovery came from records showing Daniel had secretly monitored Emily's life after vanishing. Investigators uncovered evidence that he occasionally searched her social media accounts through anonymous profiles. He knew when she moved apartments. He knew when her mother died. He even knew she attended grief counseling for several years after his disappearance. Despite all of it, he never contacted her once. He allowed her suffering to continue, because contacting her would have destroyed the new identity he had spent years constructing. Detective Aaron Mitchell later admitted this detail affected him more than anything else in the investigation. It wasn't just that he left, Mitchell reportedly told journalists. It's that he watched the damage from a distance and chose silence every single time. Public reaction across Australia became explosive once details reached the media. Talkback radio shows debated whether Daniel Carter was a criminal mastermind or simply a selfish coward. Some viewers became obsessed with the psychological side of the story. How does a human being wake up every morning beside a new family, while knowing another person still cries over their death? Others focused on Laura Reynolds and the children, who suddenly discovered their husband and father had never truly existed at all. Friends close to Laura described her complete collapse after learning the truth. Imagine realizing every document, every story, every memory inside your marriage was built on another person's stolen identity. Laura reportedly refused to speak publicly for years afterward. The children faced bullying at school once media coverage intensified. In a matter of weeks, Daniel Carter destroyed 2 separate families at the same time. For Emily, the emotional damage became impossible to describe properly. People assumed discovering Daniel alive would bring closure, but closure never came. Instead, she struggled with a completely different kind of grief. The man she mourned for 11 years had technically never existed in the way she believed. Every memory became contaminated by suspicion. Every loving gesture suddenly felt questionable. Emily later admitted she stopped trusting her own judgment entirely. If someone could fake love for over a decade, how could anyone ever truly know another person? Therapists working with trauma survivors often describe betrayal as one of the deepest psychological wounds because it forces victims to question reality itself. Emily was not simply recovering from abandonment anymore. She was recovering from the destruction of certainty. During court proceedings, prosecutors revealed one final detail that horrified the public even further. On the night before his staged boating accident, Daniel had recorded multiple farewell messages on a small tape recorder. Some sounded emotional, others sounded rehearsed. But one particular recording never reached Emily, because investigators found it hidden among old belongings after his arrest. In it, Daniel spoke quietly for nearly 7 minutes about wanting a second chance at life. He described feeling suffocated by responsibilities and disappointment. Then, near the end of the recording, he said something chilling. "People only remember the best parts of you after you are gone." That sentence changed the entire case for many observers. Because it suggested Daniel did not merely want escape, he wanted reinvention. He wanted control over how people remembered him. Eventually, Daniel Carter pleaded guilty to multiple fraud-related charges connected to identity falsification, financial deception, and insurance violations. Yet for many people following this story, prison never felt like adequate punishment. Prison sentences have endings. The emotional damage left behind in lives like Emily's does not. Even years later, she reportedly struggled entering shopping centers without panic attacks. The exact place where she discovered the truth became permanently attached to one of the most devastating moments of her life. Imagine grieving someone for over a decade only to learn they abandoned you willingly. Imagine realizing the person you loved watched you suffer from a distance while building birthday memories with another family. There are wounds that time heals. And then there are wounds that permanently alter the way someone sees the world. Today, the story of Emily and Daniel Carter still unsettles people because it forces a deeply uncomfortable question into the open. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? Most betrayals happen suddenly. Affairs, lies, disappearances. But Daniel's deception lasted over a decade because he understood something terrifying about human nature. People trust consistency, they trust routines. They trust familiar smiles, shared histories, ordinary mornings. And sometimes the most dangerous lies are not dramatic at all. Sometimes they are built quietly over years until the truth becomes almost impossible to recognize. For 11 years, Emily Carter believed the ocean had taken her husband forever. In reality, the ocean had simply hidden the moment he chose another life over the one he already had. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this. If Emily had looked down at her phone for just a few seconds longer inside that Queensland shopping center, she may have walked past him forever without ever knowing the truth. After Daniel Carter's arrest, most people assumed the story had finally reached its ending. Newspapers framed it as a shocking fraud case. Television panels argued about psychology, narcissism, and deception. Strangers online called Daniel a monster, while others tried to understand how someone could erase an entire identity and begin again as if the first life had never happened. But for Emily Carter, the real nightmare began after the headlines faded away. Because once the cameras disappear and the reporters stop calling, victims are left alone with questions that never fully leave them. Questions that wake them up at 3 a.m, years later. Questions that slowly poison every memory they once trusted. Emily could not stop replaying the final years of her marriage. She remembered moments that once felt ordinary, but now carried a completely different meaning. The late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, the growing emotional distance. Even small things began haunting her. Daniel stopped celebrating anniversaries during the final 2 years before he disappeared. He claimed work stress made him exhausted, but now Emily wondered whether he had already emotionally left the marriage long before the boating accident. She remembered one argument in particular that suddenly felt unbearable in hindsight. About 6 months before his disappearance, Emily confronted Daniel after discovering receipts from Queensland hidden inside his truck. Daniel became unusually defensive that night. He accused her of being paranoid. He slept on the couch afterward. The next morning he apologized, kissed her forehead, and brought home flowers. For years, Emily remembered that apology as proof their marriage could survive difficult moments. Now she realized he had likely been protecting another life already forming hundreds of miles away. Investigators later uncovered evidence suggesting Daniel first met Laura Reynolds nearly 4 years before the staged boating accident. They crossed paths at a marine supply conference in Brisbane, where Daniel had been representing his repair company. Friends described Laura as warm, trusting, and deeply family-oriented. At the time, she had recently separated from a former partner and was raising a young daughter alone. Daniel entered her life, presenting himself as a lonely man trapped in an unhappy marriage. He told Laura that his relationship with Emily had become cold and emotionally empty. According to statements Laura later gave investigators, Daniel claimed he stayed in Sydney only because he felt responsible for Emily after years of fertility struggles and depression. He painted himself as a man sacrificing his happiness out of guilt. It was a carefully constructed story designed to turn sympathy into emotional loyalty. Laura believed him completely. The deeper detectives investigated Daniel's double life, the more disturbing the timeline became. While Emily spent years grieving miscarriages and mourning the family she never had, Daniel was secretly becoming a father with another woman. His oldest son in Queensland had already been born nearly 2 years before the boating accident occurred. That revelation destroyed Emily more than anything else investigators uncovered. During interviews, she reportedly broke down, repeatedly asking the same question. How do you hold your wife while she cries about never having children? Then leave to visit your secret son? Detectives had no answer for her, because some forms of betrayal exist beyond normal human understanding. Friends close to Daniel's Queensland life described him as an attentive father and devoted husband. He coached weekend football games. He attended school performances. He organized camping trips for the children. Neighbors saw him as dependable and gentle. That contradiction unsettled investigators deeply. Usually, people capable of massive deception show obvious patterns of cruelty across every relationship. But Daniel seemed able to separate entire versions of himself, depending on who stood in front of him. One detective later compared it to watching two completely different personalities living inside the same body. To Emily, he was distant, secretive, and emotionally unavailable during the final years before disappearing. To Laura and the children, he appeared affectionate and stable. It was as if Daniel had carefully divided his humanity between two separate worlds while hiding the existence of each from the other. As court proceedings continued, financial investigators uncovered another disturbing truth. Daniel had not simply disappeared for love or freedom. He had profited from his own death. The life insurance payout following the boating accident totaled nearly $2 million Australian dollars. Most of it had gone directly to Emily, who used portions to pay off debt, cover legal expenses, and survive financially after losing her husband's income. But investigators discovered Daniel secretly regained access to large portions of that money through hidden joint accounts he created, using forged documentation before vanishing. Over several years, he slowly transferred funds into accounts connected to his Michael Reynolds identity. In other words, Daniel had partially financed his second family, using money connected to the tragedy that destroyed Emily's life. When this information became public, outrage intensified across Australia. Even seasoned investigators admitted they had rarely encountered deception, operating on such a personal and calculated level for so many years. Yet perhaps the darkest part of the entire story surfaced through one seemingly insignificant detail. During forensic searches of Daniel's Queensland home, police recovered dozens of old photographs hidden inside sealed containers in the garage attic. Some showed Emily smiling during holidays years earlier. Others captured ordinary moments inside their Sydney home long before the disappearance. At first, investigators assumed Daniel kept the photos out of guilt or nostalgia. But then they noticed something chilling. Several photographs contained handwritten notes on the back in Daniel's own writing. Next to one anniversary photo, he wrote, "She still believes everything." Another read, "Almost ready to leave." Detectives later admitted these notes disturbed them more than the fake identities or financial fraud, because they revealed how emotionally detached Daniel had become long before he vanished. While Emily believed she was fighting to save a struggling marriage, Daniel had apparently been documenting her trust like evidence in a private experiment. The public became obsessed with understanding Daniel's psychology. Experts appeared across television interviews discussing pathological deception and identity reinvention. Some believed Daniel displayed traits associated with narcissistic personality patterns, particularly his ability to manipulate emotional realities while maintaining different identities simultaneously. Others argued his behavior reflected a deep fear of failure and responsibility rather than pure malice. But no explanation satisfied Emily because explanations do not repair destroyed years. They do not return birthdays spent crying alone beside oceans. They do not erase 11 years of grief carved into someone's body and memory. One of the most emotional moments during sentencing came when Emily finally faced Daniel directly in court. Observers described the room becoming completely silent as she stood holding prepared notes with trembling hands. She did not scream at him, she did not insult him. Instead, she spoke quietly about what his disappearance had done to her life. She described panic attacks, therapy sessions, loneliness, and years spent blaming herself for arguments that no longer mattered. Then she looked directly at Daniel and asked a question nobody in the courtroom seemed prepared for. "Did you ever miss me at all?" Witnesses later said Daniel lowered his head but never answered. That silence reportedly affected Emily more than any confession could have. Laura Reynolds also attended portions of the proceedings, though she avoided public attention almost entirely. Her situation carried its own tragedy. Overnight, she discovered the father of her children was not merely dishonest, but legally dead under another identity. Friends close to Laura said she struggled intensely with shame, despite being another victim in the deception. She reportedly replayed every conversation she ever had with Daniel, searching for signs she should have noticed. Trauma often forces victims into impossible self-interrogation. People ask themselves whether they ignored warning signs, whether they trusted too easily, whether they somehow participated unknowingly in their own betrayal. Laura eventually relocated with the children to avoid media attention, but according to people close to the family, the emotional damage lingered for years. The children especially struggled understanding why their father suddenly existed under two completely different names depending on who told the story. As time passed, one particular question continued haunting investigators. What would have happened if Emily never spotted Daniel inside that shopping center? The answer was deeply unsettling. He likely would have continued living quietly, under the Michael Reynolds identity indefinitely. The fake death had succeeded almost perfectly. No body meant endless uncertainty, but after enough years people stopped searching for impossible answers. Daniel understood that. He relied on time erasing suspicion, and for more than a decade it worked. Even now, many people remain fascinated by the story because it touches a fear far deeper than ordinary crime. Most people understand violence. Most people understand greed. But stories like this force us to confront something harder to accept. The possibility that a person can share your home, your bed, your memories, your future plans, while secretly living inside an entirely different reality you cannot see. That idea unsettles people because it destroys one of the most comforting beliefs humans depend on. The belief that intimacy guarantees understanding. Emily Carter eventually left Sydney years after the case ended. Friends say she wanted distance from the coastline, from the memories, from every street connected to Daniel's disappearance. She never remarried. Some wounds change people permanently. Yet those who know her describe remarkable resilience beneath the trauma. She rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, after surviving one of the cruelest emotional betrayals imaginable. Still, according to people close to her, certain moments never stopped hurting. Passing boating stores. Hearing Daniel's favorite songs unexpectedly in public. Seeing families together inside shopping centers. Because despite everything Daniel stole from her, one truth remained impossible to escape. For 11 years, Emily loved a man she believed was dead, and discovering he was alive turned out to be far more painful than losing him to the ocean ever was. Sometimes people disappear beneath waves and are never found again. But sometimes the far more frightening possibility is that they were never truly lost at all.